Welcome to part 2 of the session on OCI Identity and Access Management Level 200. My name is KD and I am a part of the OCI product management team. In the first part of this session, we summarized the Identity and Access Management or the IAM service and its key components, and then we went deeper into what instance principles are, why they are useful, and how do you configure dynamic groups to use instance principles. We will start part 2 with multi-factor authentication and how do you set it up in OCI, and then we will look at how do you write IAM policies at an advanced in a more advanced manner. So I'm going to skip the first few slides since they were covered in part 1. We will start part 2 with multi-factor authentication. I think pretty much everyone who's listening or if you're watching this video is familiar with MFAs, but the notion of multi-factor authentication is that it requires you to use more than one way to authenticate your identity. In general, the MFA may include two of the following components, right? Something you know, like a password, is something you have, like a device with a MFA app in it that generates a code. And then another option is something that you are, like your fingerprint. So in this case, by using MFA or multi-factor authentication in OCI, you would need your username password as the first factor of authentication, and the second factor of authentication is using a MFA app to generate the one-time temporary password or that that you would need as the second factor. So to and once you are able to provide these two forms of authentication, you are then logged in. So multi-factor authentication is a best practice from security point of view. MFA is enabled for a specific user and for a specific device that this user has. The procedure to enable MFA for a user includes the registration of this mobile device and the mobile authenticator app on it. The two apps that we have tested this against and that are supported are the Oracle mobile authenticator app as well as the Google authenticator app. You can get these apps from the App Store in your device ecosystem, the Google Play Store or the Apple Store for iPhones. And let's actually take a quick look at how do you set it up in the OCI console. So in this case, I'm on my user details page. You would click on Enable Multi-Factor Authentication. When you click that, you will be presented with um, a code, and this QR code you have to scan with your device using the authenticator app, and then you would be presented a code, and that verification code is put over here. And once it is set it up, the next time you want to log in, besides your password, you will be asked for this one-time temporary password. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is IAM policies and dive deeper into how you can write very granular policies with IAM in OCI. Uh, so the policy syntax, if you have seen the part 100, this should look familiar to you. If you have not seen it, I would encourage you to please watch that series first, because they would go into IAM policy basics in a deeper manner. But I'll summarize here. The policy syntax starts with allow, and you can put more than one space, or you can break up the line, does not matter. But after allow, you put a subject. The subject could be one or more than one comma separated groups that you have set up in IAM. These groups can be listed by name or by their OSITs. Uh, so you can put groups, you can put dynamic groups, or you can also say any dash user. If you say any dash user, it would apply to all the users, right? So again, you can have the names that are separated by comma, or you can have the keyword group followed, or dynamic group followed by the keyword ID, and then the OSIT. Then you can have comma, you can have another ID, and then the OSIT, and etc. So after you have put in the right subject or subjects, you specify the verb that you want to uh, use based on the type of access. The four verbs are inspect, read, use, and manage. Inspect gives you ability to just list the resources, and manage includes all the possible permissions, and read and use are in between inspect and manage. Uh, After the verb, there you can only put one verb in one policy statement. You can have multiple statements in a single policy document, but for each statement you can only put one verb. You then specify a resource type. This resource type could be a single resource type, uh, and this could be individual resource, or there could be a family resource type. A single resource type, you can include individual resources. You can say things like VCN or subnet or objects. These are all examples of individual resources. Or you can also write a family of resource type. The families are listed here. These families sort of club a variety of related components together. And for example, the object family would include the resource types of buckets and objects. But if you want to write a policy against object family, both these types of resources are included. This just uh, makes it easier to write policies on related type of resources. Uh, and then there is a location. You must specify a location. You can specify a single compartment, or the path name of that compartment, or its OSIT, or you can just say tenancy to cover the entire tenancy. But you have to put some location in there. If you want to attach a policy to a compartment, you must be in the compartment when you create the policy. And finally, there is an optional where and then conditions. And these where conditions are the more advanced form of writing policies. We will look at some examples of what kind of conditions that you can put in your IAM policies next. Let's first look at an example policy before we go into verbs and permissions. I have I'm logged into my OCI console, so you can get into policies through identity, uh, and the policies they apply at the compartment level, or you can also apply uh, policies at the root compartment level as well. So to create a policy, an example policy, let me first create a new group. I will not add users to the group, but let me create a group called network admins. Admins for all network resources in the tenancy. So this group is going to provide to be my network admins for all the VCN, subnet, uh, and internet gateways, DRGs, all of that, right? So all of that is part of the virtual network family. So I don't have to specify all these resources separately. So I can so I'm at the root level because I want to write a tenancy level policy. I can call it policy. And the statement could be something like allow group network admins to manage virtual network family in the tenancy. So rather than specifying everything separately in terms of which resources to manage, I just gave the single name. What I can also do is, as I was saying earlier, instead of the group name, I can also specify the group ID right here. So I can say uh, something like go to the statements and I can, let me just add a new statement. Uh, Allow group ID and then this OSID to manage network, virtual network family in tenancy. Right, so I can add statements like this. Now let's discuss the notion of permissions. Permissions, if we define it, it's just atomic unit of authorization that is given to a user via a group when you write the policy. And this permission enables this user to perform operations on the resources. So this is the authorization mechanism. So all the permissions are defined in the policy language. So when you actually write a policy in which you give a group access to a particular resource or resource family using a verb, what essentially happens is you're giving permissions, some predefined permissions for certain API operations. Right, so to make it easy, let's read this diagram on the right. Right, the best way to read this diagram is when you, let's say, write a policy. So we wrote the policy called allow group network admins to manage the virtual network family in tenancy. So in this case, your verb in this example is manage. So when you write the policy with the manage verb and the resource is actually the volumes family in this case, what you end up essentially doing is giving some permissions, some predefined permissions. These permissions include a volume delete, volume create, and all the permissions given by the use verb. Use verb gives it volume write, volume update, and all the permissions given by read, which gives it a volume inspect permission. So essentially, writing a policy called allow group name, any name, to manage volumes family in tenancy would give this group the permissions to delete volumes, create volumes, write volumes, update volumes, and inspect volumes in the tenancy. And what these permissions actually translate to is allowing certain API operations. So, once you have the volume delete permissions, you will be able to do the delete volume API operation on the resources. And if you have the volume create permissions, you'll be able to create volume, do the create volume API operation. Certain permissions give access to more than one API operation. So in this case, volume inspect gives get volume and list volume API operation authorization to your end user. So what the verbs are essentially helping you is to, rather than remember all these permissions, so rather than writing all the permission names for all the resources, you now just have to remember the verbs, and just a combination of verb and the resource type is going to give you all the permissions you need for the API operation. Just makes it easier for you. If you want to, for example, if you want to take a look at the policy language and look at all the permissions, permissions are essentially what comes out of verb plus resource type combination. This is the policy reference. You can go to the documentation and get to it. You will see that, if even for something like a subnet, uh, there are a whole bunch of permissions, right? All these permissions are covered by the manage verb. This plus everything under use is covered by a single verb manage. So rather than giving all these permissions, which allow all these APIs uh, to happen, rather than listing them explicitly, the verbs just make it very easy for you to intuitively write the very powerful policies in a easy manner. That's a big differentiator with OCI. And another thing is, the API operations. For certain API operations, you would need multiple permissions as well, right? If you have, let's say that you want uh, to allow a user to be able to attach some volumes to an instance, you must need access to multiple permissions. In this case, it's in this example you see that uh, a single permission is giving access to multiple operations, but sometimes for a single operation you might need access to multiple permissions. For the attach volume, you would need access to permissions called volume write, right? So volume write is somewhere here, so you would need access to this permission, but you would also need to uh, get access to the volume attachment create and volume instance, so and the instance attach volume permission. So three different permissions required for a single API operation. Some of these permissions are part of the volumes volume family, and some are part of the instance family. For certain API operations you might need to write more than one policy as well. uh, and we provide the commonly used policies are actually provided in the documentation as well. So if you go to documentation, you can go to the policy reference, like I showed, but you can also go to common policies, and we will give you examples of all the commonly used policies. So it's a good starting point for you as you are getting started with writing IAM policies and getting into the advanced features of writing policies in OCI. This would tell you to give, for example, to give auditors inspect permissions in your to your resources. You would need to write these three policies. So it's a good resource for you to get started with OCI policies. All right. So now let's get into the details of the where conditions. The condition itself. So after the where keyword, you need to specify a condition. The condition itself has two parts. So it has a variable and a value. So you write variable is equal to value or variable is not equal to value. And the variables are of two types themselves. There are the request kind of variables, and then there are target kind of variables. The request kind of variables have something to do with the API operation being requested, and the target kind of variables are something related to the resources on which the policy is going to act. Right, so you either write request dot something, or you write target dot something. The request variables could be request dot operation. So this is an API operation type of variable. Then there is request dot permission, the request dot user dot ID, the OSID of the requesting user. So this is all related to the requests. The OSID of the groups is request dot groups dot ID, and there is request dot region. In this example, there is allow groups, a group called Phoenix admins, to manage all resources in the tenancy, where the request dot region is this PHX, right? Uh, and this would actually, when you resolve the when you evaluate this condition, it's either going to be true or false. If it is true, the policy is enforced, is valid, and if it is false, the policy is not enforced. The policy does not apply for that particular request in this case. And when it comes to the value part, there can be uh, two type of values. There could be a single string kind of value, or a pattern kind of a value. The string value is a single thing in single quotation mark around that, like the PHX we saw on the last slide. And then there is the pattern kind of values, in which you can do pattern matching for more complicated kind of scenarios. So in this case, HR star matches the string that starts with HR. It's the normal pattern matching kind of syntax. Uh, where the condition has variables which are request dot something or target dot something, and then the value can be in single quotation mark, or it could be a parent matching kind of a value. You can specify one or more than one conditions. The single condition we already looked at. This, for example, is a single condition. You write where, and then there is uh, the variable, and then the value. This is a single condition. But after where, if you put any or all, then you can have multiple pairs of variables and values in it. In this example, you allow this group XYZ to manage groups in tenancy, where any of request dot operation is all of this, right? So if any, so this is or kind of an operator. And in this other example, where the keyword is all, this is an and kind of a operator. So both these conditions need uh, uh, to be true for this thing to be valid, right? So as you can see, using the where conditions, you can be very dynamic in your policies. So these are evaluated when they are enforced, and the conditions are evaluated, and if the condition is true, then it's enforced. And you can write and or kind of conditions for multiple conditions in a single policy statement. And you can have values which are string or pattern type to match a lot of different options at the same time. This is an example of some advanced policies. Actually, let's go back to the console and continue working on the advanced policy using the policy we were looking at, right? So we had these two policies for network admins. So let me just uh, delete these. Hold on. I will also need, actually, I need to, uh, for my policy, I am going to target a particular compartment. So let me get that compartment ID. Let's see that I want to uh, write this policy on the compartment called IT. So I can now uh, write a policy that says something like uh, allow group uh, network admins to manage uh, virtual network family. Now I put where instead of in tenancy, I just put where target dot compartment dot id equals, and then I can put the OCD. I forgot the location. I still need to specify where before where the location, and then I can complete my statement. Okay, now this statement is applied, right? So you can look at some more examples quickly. The first example is for a group called group admins to manage groups in the tenancy where the target.group.name is the pattern matching of a dash users dash something. So all those groups with this pattern would be where this policy is applicable. The second example shows allow the group admins to manage the membership of any groups besides the administrators group. So in this case, the target.group.name variable and the value is with not equal to administrator. So anything except administrator uh, would be uh, would be true for this particular condition. And then you can write even more finer grained policies than that using the all and kind of keywords like we looked at. Um, and the last example is, in this case, there is a group called training group that needs to manage the virtual network family, so VCNs, etc. And the location of this policy is in the compartment called training. They are allowed to manage everything related to network virtual network family, except where the permission is request or permission is VCN delete. So they cannot delete the VCNs, but except in other than deleting the VCNs, anything else related to the networks, they are able to do that. With that, let me wrap up this part. In this part, we looked at some of the advanced uh, policy features, and we discussed the concept of verbs and permissions, and how they give access to API operations. We looked at the the where conditions and what kind of conditions you can write, and what the two type of variables are, the request and the target variables. The two types of values could be a string kind of a value or a parent matching kind of a value, and then we have any or all keywords for writing multiple conditions in a single where with a single where keyword. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to having you join in the next part of this session.